Good day everyone, Composer99 here, and welcome to Axis Empires Ultimate Edition. In the second video of this series, we're going to start the playthrough of a game starting from the 1937 start date of a full 2-map campaign. In this video, we're going to review each of the three factions' early game strategies that we want to pursue for this game, and we're also going to play through the first year of play. If we look at our calendar, that's going to be the spring, summer, autumn, and winter seasons of 1937 and verging a little into 1938. We're going to stop before starting the spring 1938 turn. Without any further ado, let's get started. First up, let's look at Axis strategy. As you can see, the Axis begins play with 2 German infantry steps and an influence marker in Austria. That's not a lot, so we're going to have to build the Germans up before we can go conquer our neighbors. As we can see, and as a reminder from our last video, most of our pre-war cards are focused on building up German forces and extracting territory from our neighbors through territorial demands. We also have several cards that are going to let us support the Spanish nationalists during the Civil War. Several of these options might also help us build our own coalition of minor country allies, assuming the Western and Soviet factions don't throw too many spanners in the work, of course. There are several important decisions that the Axis are going to want to make during pre-war. The most important of which is probably, do they want to attack France first or Russia first? Whichever country you choose, you're probably going to want to start the war around the fall of 1939 and be ready to fight that country in the summer of 1940 with your limited war blitz cards. You might be able to extend pre-war. If so, you're going to want pre-war to start sometime in summer or fall of 1940, and in that case be ready to knock out your chosen enemy in the summer of 1941. Once we've decided which direction we want to go first, west or east, we then have to decide how we're going to get there, by which I mean which territorial demands we're going to make. As we can see from some of our early cards, we're going to have to remove some of our demand and Ribbentrop diplomacy cards. We have to remove one such card when we play our card 2, another card when we play our card 3, and yet another card when we play our card 7. Excuse me, 2 cards when we play our card 7. The cards that we choose to keep are going to shape which countries we're making territorial demands of, so it's a good idea to pick countries that are going to help us with our immediate enemy, though possibly a little long-term thinking is helpful too. The next question we have to ask is, do we want to create the Nazi-Soviet pact, or do we want to uphold the Pact of Steel? This choice is going to drive which card 4 that we play. Pact of Steel is a helpful play if we have managed to spread influence markers on nearby countries, allowing us to activate them as Axis countries. The downside of Pact of Steel is that it clears the way for the Western or Soviet factions to play their Franco-Russian Entente card. As such, I'd consider playing Pact of Steel if you already know that they can't play Franco-Russian Entente. Nazi-Soviet pact changes the posture of Russia and Soviet miners to pact, which, being a non-aggression treaty, makes it very hard for Russia to declare war on you. It also grants you as many as 6 German infantry steps. As such, it may be preferable even when Franco-Russian Entente is not a consideration, because German infantry steps, as we've noted previously, are just better than minor country infantry steps. The last question facing us is the degree to which we want to support the Spanish nationalists. As we can see, we have 5 support nationalist cards. So we can eventually run out, which could be a problem if we're not very lucky in our political roles. Unlike the Western and Soviet Spanish Civil War cards, our cards grant us additional political influence around the map. We can remove an influence or neutrality marker, which we can use to manipulate the political situation in Europe. Or, if we feel lucky, we can roll on an area table, and if the result is a neutral or friendly minor country, we can apply influence to it. A friendly minor country, by the way, is a country that we have already activated as an Axis country. For example, we might use a Spanish Civil War card to remove the neutrality marker in Italy, paving the way for us to activate Italy as an Axis minor country later on. We might also use it to roll on the Balkan, Middle East, Northern, Central, or other area tables in an attempt to place influence markers in countries in those areas with a view to joining them in either with a later play of support nationalists or with Pact of Steel, or during limited war with our treaty cards. A few important hints to think about. With respect to the Spanish Civil War, as long as the Spanish Civil War rages on, Madrid will count as a Western or Soviet-controlled hex for the purpose of counting strategic value, as long as it has the Republican capital marker. As such, we do have some incentive to eventually win the Civil War. For their part, the Western and Soviet factions may not care about winning the Civil War, but they will certainly be happy to drag it out. Another thing to think about is that we do not want France to stay in the war for the entire duration of the game. Not only is that going to give the Western faction a big pile of extra steps that they'll be able to use against us, but it's also going to make it very easy for the Americans to land in Europe. Both of those are very undesirable. As such, whether we choose to go fight France first or Russia first, we are going to want to make sure that we defeat France, and if possible, evict the Western faction from continental Europe before the Americans get in the war. Those are the major German strategic considerations during pre-war and early on. With that in mind, for this game, let's think about what we want to do. It's very easy to end up fighting France first, even if we really wanted to fight Russia, especially once the Western faction has played Western guarantees. The reason for that is that most countries, when we make a territorial demand of them, are going to end up aligning with the Western faction. Once the Western faction has played Western guarantees, if any of those rolls go badly, and we have a country resist result, that will activate the country as a Western country and start the war. Obviously, once that's happened, we probably don't want to try to press on with fighting Russia first. As such, if we want to fight Russia first, we're going to have to be cagey with our territorial demands. Because political roles are unreliable, the more often we're picking up the dice to demand territory, the more likely it is that we're going to end up starting a war. For our pre-war option card planning, there are two broad directions we can take. We can try to squeeze out as many German steps as possible, while also getting in our territorial demands, or we can try to throw in support for the Spanish nationalists here and there. One thing we should note are the restrictions on how we can play cards. For instance, we can't play support nationalist cards one after the other. We have to alternate between support nationalists and some other card. The same rule applies to any of our territorial demand cards. We can't play them one after another. And of course, Our rearmament cards, the ones with the rearmament symbol, may only be played once per year. One final set of selection requirements to make note of is that our Ribbentrop diplomacy and demand cards all depend on the play of card 7, military purges. You can see that our first couple of demand cards, the ones that don't require that we have already played a Ribbentrop diplomacy or demand card, require the previous play of military purges. The same is true for Ribbentrop diplomacy cards. For its part, military purges requires that we have already played card 2, German requirement, and card 2 in turn requires that we have played card 1, Goring Works Established. In other words, in our first year of play, we probably already have 3 of a possible 4 option cards spoken for. The remaining question is, how early do we want to start making territorial demands? If we play card 1, card 2, and then card 7 in immediate order, we could demand Austria or Denmark as early as the winter 1937 season. Of course, we might want to assist the nationalists, particularly during the summer. In that case, we will push back our first territorial demand until the historical spring 1938 season. Summer is a good season to support the Spanish nationalists. If, though, we're trying to focus on building out the German army, we may decide to play our card 1 during the summer for that one extra German step. With that in mind, let's at least think through the first year or two of option card play. We know that we can't play card 6 until 1940 if we're ever in fact able to play it at all. As we can see, the selection requirements for card 6 include pre-war in effect. That means if any of our territorial demands goes badly, we may forego the chance to play those cards. If we're planning to extend pre-war, we will want to play card 6, so we're going to have to be careful about our territorial demands, if that's the case. Card 5 and Card 3 are going to have to wait until 1938 and 1939. We know we want to play Card 1 and 2 and 7, in that order. The remaining question is, when do we want to play Support Nationalists? For this playthrough, I'm going to assume that an extra political role on the Support Nationalist card is more valuable than one extra German step. As such, we're going to play Support Nationalists during the summer season. Let's get one of our cards and put it up in the top row so that we have that plan ready to go. That gives us our 1937 planning. At this point, we are going to have removed 3 Ribbentrop diplomacy or demand cards. We're going to put those cards along the bottom here so we know which ones we're getting rid of. Let's just shuffle those over. If we want to go after France first, we probably don't want to demand Switzerland. Despite the fact that a successful Swiss demand extends our line against the French. In fact, Switzerland is more useful because you get a mountain step if you're planning a northern strategy of trying to bring Sweden and Finland into the Axis coalition. As such, if anything, Demand Switzerland is almost more of an anti-Soviet card. The mountain unit that you get for demanding Switzerland can be combined with a minor country ski step to form a mountain army. The only countries that get ski steps are Switzerland, Norway, Denmark, Finland, and Sweden. I should say Denmark, Norway. They are treated as one country for the purpose of the rules. Given all that, Demand Switzerland is a good choice of a card to get rid of if we're not planning to go after Russia first. If we're planning a northern strategy where we're trying to activate Sweden and Finland as Axis coalition partners before going to war with Russia, one thing we have to note is that we have to control a country or German dependent adjacent to Sweden before we can activate it as an Axis minor. That means we would first have to either activate Denmark-Norway as an Axis minor, or we have to use our Demand Denmark card to transform Denmark into a German dependent. If we're planning on going after France first, we're likely to not want to pursue the northern strategy. As such, we can ignore Demand Denmark. Another possibility would be to discard Demand Lithuania. Assuming, however, that the Soviet Union is going to annex eastern Poland and the Baltic states, demanding Lithuania grants us flanking position on the Soviet setup in eastern Poland. And it improves our position vis-a-vis the Soviets in the Baltic states, extending their line and giving us a salient out of which to attack. As such, let's hold on to demand Lithuania for now. We're certainly going to want to demand Austria and Czechoslovakia. Those are almost obligatory requirements. In particular, the Czechoslovakia demand gets us an armor step, which is pretty hard to turn down. It's fairly easy for Germany to run out of armor steps in its force pool, especially if we don't take heavy losses early on in the game. As such, every armor step we can get from territorial demands is helpful. That leaves us with Demand Gaumoseland and Demand Polish Corridor. Demand Gaumoseland, in and of itself, isn't getting us very much. A cavalry step, which is okay, but not amazing, and one hex here in the Belgium-Holland country. That's not bad for flanking the Belgians and Dutch and being ready to attack France. But the reality is, we're going to be able to easily take that hex when we declare war on Belgium-Holland anyway. However, Demand Gaumoseland might be a great card to play in order to spark the war with Britain and France. The reason for this is that when a country resists event causes a war, you, the country playing it, get a blitz marker that you can play. Blitz markers are what drive your offensive activity. That will allow us to easily crush Belgium-Holland and possibly nab a hex or two in France proper in advance of our summer offensive. The last territorial demand we're going to want to think about is demanding the Polish corridor. On the one hand, having Poland as a minor country ally can be useful against the Soviets. On the other hand, having the overland route connecting East Prussia and the rest of Germany is valuable. So also is having Posen as another reinforcement location for units bound for the Eastern Front. And of course, demanding the Polish corridor gets us another panzer step. With all that in mind, we probably have to decide to either start the war by demanding Gaumoseland or by demanding the Polish corridor. Let's plan to demand Gaumoseland in the fall of 1939. If the Belgians don't resist our demand, we'll plan for an extended pre-war and demand the Polish corridor in the fall of 1940. That should guarantee that we end up at war with the Western faction. The only possible fly in the ointment is that the Soviets might be able to place an influence marker in Poland, in which case, if the Poles resist our demand, we could end up at war with Russia early. At that point, though, that's probably okay. The last thing to note is that if somehow the Poles even buckle under and give way to our demand, Card 6, by starting Limited War, will allow us to play Limited War cards that will be able to allow us to declare war on minor countries. With all that in mind, let's plan out what we want to do for 1938. We're just going to shuffle some of these cards around. Since we want these 5 demands, we're going to have to get rid of at least one Ribbentrop diplomacy card. We'll shuffle these cards down here. We're going to demand Austria in the spring and Czechoslovakia. Actually, we might wait on Czechoslovakia because they're less likely to resist. And we want to safeguard against an early Western play of Western guarantees. In theory, the Western faction can play Western guarantees as early as summer 1938. The very small number of Western steps on the board at that point makes it unlikely that they will actually do so, but they might, so it is something to watch out for. We're going to plan to demand Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939 and Galmoseland in the fall of 1939. We then have to pad out our winter and summer turns. We'll play card 3 Continuing Rearmament in the winter of 1938, and, since we have time, we'll play Support Nationalists in the summer of 1938. Because we want to fight the West first, we're definitely going to plan to play Nazi-Soviet Pact in the summer of 1939. Let's just shuffle a few cards around here. That leaves German mobilization in the winter of 1939. We will have to remove our remaining Ribbentrop diplomacy card as part of our play of card 3. If the demand of Galmoseland works out as planned and starts the war, then our plan will be to use Demand Polish Corridor later during limited war in order to set ourselves up for the eventual attack on the Soviet Union. That is the Axis pre-war strategy. Let's carry on to the Western faction. The Western faction. As we can see, the Western faction has the garrison forces in the Mediterranean and pretty small armies in Great Britain and France. If we're going to withstand the German onslaught in the early game, we're going to need bigger armies. For the Western faction, the big questions are when to try to change the Western minor posture to ensure that German territorial demands will start a war, and, in addition to timing, whether to play Western guarantees or Franco-Russian Entente. The other question is, which card 6 to play? The Western faction has to decide how much they want to emphasize building up the British army. Until the play of one of your card 5 options, 5A or 5B, the only card that the Western faction can play that brings British steps out of the force pool onto the board is card 9, Chamberlain Diplomacy. As such, up till that point, it's very difficult to bring British steps into play. We might choose to maximize the size of the French army at the expense of the British. One danger of that, though, of course, is that the British, having one step in London, could be unprepared for an invasion of England. And of course, they have other commitments for their army as well. They'll want to send an expeditionary force to France during the early war, for instance, and eventually, quite possibly, or even quite probably, defend Egypt against Axis attack. As such, we're certainly going to want to play Chamberlain diplomacy at least once or twice during the pre-war period. The last decision facing the Western faction is whether or not to play their Support Republicans card. In part, that's going to depend on whether or not they're actually supporting the Spanish Republicans. During this scenario setup, someone has to roll a die to determine which allied faction starts the game supporting the Republicans. That faction can change depending on how political events work out. But unless the Western faction is supporting the Republicans, there's no point in them playing their Support Republicans card. If they are supporting the Republicans, they have to ask themselves whether it's worth playing that card over some other card they could play. The Western faction probably wants to push the Axis into fighting Russia first. The reason for that is essentially all the reasons we talked about in the Axis strategy section about why they want to destroy France. Having France remain in the game over the course of the entire war is extremely valuable for the Western faction. Not only is that going to mean a difference of in the range of 4 dozen or more steps in the Allied army over the course of the total war period, it also means having a base for American forces on the continent. As we've noted, however, the Germans are well aware of this and are going to do their utmost to prevent it from happening. If France is conquered by Germany, either through the play of their case yellow card or through old-fashioned conquering all of France's cities, most French units disappear from the game. Only a handful of units, the ones that have a V code on the marker, are going to stay in play. As such, the French are strongly incentivized to find ways to stay in the game in order to keep their counter density. With all that out of the way, let's start working through what the Western faction wants to do during this playthrough. One thing to note is that a lot of our cards rely on having played Card 3, French Rearmament. Card 3 itself relies on the play of Card 2, so we won't be able to play Card 3 until the spring of 1938 at the earliest. Card 2 requires the play of Card 1, Change of Governments. Chamberlain Diplomacy also requires the play of Card 1, Change of Governments. As such, we are going to want to play Card 1 and Card 2 in 1937. The next question is, what other cards are we going to want to play? We might consider playing Support Republicans if the Western faction is supporting the Republicans at the start of the game. Because of the British military commitments we discussed earlier, we're certainly going to want to play Chamberlain Diplomacy at least once in 1937. And if we haven't supported the Republicans, probably twice. So, let's shuffle some cards around here. We're just going to move some of those out of the way so we can shuffle some of these down. And some of these. And some of these. That's one possible organization of cards that we can use. If we're supporting the Republicans, we could play Support Republicans in the spring and Change of Governments in the summer in order to maximize the number of French steps on the board. On the other hand, playing Support Republicans during the summer gives us more chances to stall out the Civil War. Although, given the unreliability of political roles, it could also blow up in our face and hand the Spanish Republic over to the nationalists. We're going to assume for the time being that the Republican support is going to be on the Soviet side and plan our cards accordingly. With that in mind, we're planning to play Card 1 Change of Governments in the spring, Card 9 in the summer, Card 2 in the autumn, and then Card 9 again in the winter, because Card 9 is recyclable. In 1938, we're going to play French Rearmament right away in the spring. The next question is, what card do we want to play in the summer? I suspect the answer to that depends on whether we want to play Card 6A Maginot Line Completed or Card 6B French Military Reforms. Card 6A Maginot Line Completed is a good card to play in the fall or winter of 1938 because it has no political or conditional events that trigger turn over turn. Card 6B does have a conditional event that gives us French infantry steps. As such, unless we have a compelling reason to play Support Republicans or Chamberlain Diplomacy in the summer, we might actually consider playing that. Although perhaps not. Maybe we value those political events more than one more French step. Which of those cards to play, though? If we play Western Guarantees early, that risks a spring 1939 war against Germany. If that's the case, we're likely to have wanted to have the Maginot Line ready to go. As we can see from the map, the Germans can get a decent attack on Strasbourg if we don't have the Maginot Forts in play, because they won't have to cross the Rhine River. If we think that the war is going to be pushed back a bit, French military reforms might be a stronger play. The interceptor is very valuable during the summer 1940 campaign because it's going to contest German Air Force placement, which is going to weaken the overall German offensive. The Maginot Line is useful for funneling the German offensive in 1940, but it's not really going to blunt the offensive or otherwise defang it. The interceptor may well do so. If we look at the Maginot Line completed and French military reforms cards, we can see that they also affect which of our cards 27 is available. Let's go have a look at those. Card 27A is the follow-on to 6A Maginot Line completed. That gives France 3 more forts. The Maginot Line forts have to be built in the hexes you would expect for the Maginot Line, along the frontier with Germany. Gamelin Line forts have to be built in France. We also need to build them in front of a minor country, or Germany, if for some reason one of our Maginot forts has been destroyed and we don't want to wait to rebuild it. Most likely, we'll probably be extending our fort line from Verdun to the Channel. If Germany goes east first, that could give us the chance to activate Belgium-Holland as a Western country, and when war starts, potentially begin the war with French and British units in Belgium-Holland able to fall back to the fort line. That would certainly be a respectable defense against a 1941 German attack. On the other hand, French military expanded is a much better long-term play with an HQ, a couple of extra infantry colonial steps, and a surface fleet support unit. As such, our card 6 essentially asks us whether we feel lucky. Well, do we, punk? With that in mind, we have to ask ourselves, when do we want to play our card 7? Because 7A Western Guarantees requires the play of card 3, we could play it as early as the summer of 1938. Due to the French counter density available in 1938, however, we're not likely to want to play it that early. Card 7B, Franco-Russian Entente, requires the previous play of Card 4, French Mobilization. That means we have to wait until 1939 to play it. I'm not sure that for this playthrough we want to play Franco-Russian Entente. We probably don't care about British Ultimatum. However, one of the cards you have to get rid of when you play 7B Franco-Russian Entente as the Western faction is Card 19, Lend-Lease to Allies. That brings the Western Lend-Lease marker into play. The Lend-Lease marker, when it comes into play, can be assigned either to France or to Russia, and whichever country is given the marker is probably going to get something in the order of 24 steps over the course of the game. That's a lot of steps to give up for the Franco-Russian Entente, at least when the Western faction plays it. With that in mind, we're going to choose to play Card 7A, Western Guarantees. And with that in mind, we have to decide when we're going to play it. Due to the low counter density of the French army, before you play Card 4, it's not clear that we want to play Card 7 too early. On the other hand, playing Card 8, Negotiations with Belgium, after playing Western Guarantees gives us an opportunity to activate Belgium as a Western country before fighting Germany. Playing it too early could lead to difficulties with Germany if it starts a war before we're ready. Historically, the Western faction played Western Guarantees in the spring of 1939. We're going to play it in the winter of 1938. With that in mind, let's move our card 5A out of the way, and we'll move Western Guarantees up here. Let's move 7B down here just so it's out of the way. Then we can shuffle those. We have to wait to play that. So now What are we playing in the summer and autumn of 1938? Again, do we feel lucky? I'm not sure that we do. So we're going to pick card 6A, Maginot Line completed. We're going to play it in the autumn. We're going to plan to play Chamberlain Diplomacy again in the summer of 1938. In 1939, we're going to start by playing Negotiations with Belgium. We're going to play French Mobilization in the summer. One French step per summer turn may not be worthwhile, but two French steps definitely is. If the war starts in the spring or fall of 1939, we'll likely want to play our card 5B, Wartime Mobilization. Otherwise, we'll have to wait until 1940 to play our card 5A, British Mobilization. We might get greedy and wait to play British Mobilization anyway because we get an extra infantry step. If the war has started in the fall of 1939, as we suspect it is likely to do, we're going to be able to get to play limited war cards, so we don't have to worry about trying to pad out our hand. If the war doesn't start in 1939 and we have to extend it to 1940, we can then start playing some of these other Little Entente, Scandinavian League, and other league cards in order to spread around Western influence, and, since our posture is guarantees, potentially activate countries for the Western faction. Let's talk a little bit about activating countries as Western countries. In order to use the influence political event to activate a country for the Western faction, it cannot have a posture of Locarno. That means we either need to switch our posture of Western minors to Entente or guarantees in order to bring them in on our side. Or, of course, we have to wait for Germany to declare war on them. The same, incidentally, goes for the Soviet faction. The Soviets cannot align Soviet minors with a posture of Cordon. They need to switch their posture to Entente or Pact first. With all that in mind, I think we're done with the Western faction for now. Finally, let's talk about Soviet pre-war strategy. As we mentioned in our previous video, the Soviet faction setup is waiting until we decide which card 1 we're going to play as the Soviets. That is our first and most important decision, at least for now. Let's look through those three cards. Card 1A, Military Purges, the historical play. Probably the worst card 1 to play. We're not getting anything out of it except for removing cards. The card chain that it introduces, however, is probably the best card chain out of the options. Card 4A, Russian Mobilization, requires the play of card 1A. The forces you receive are comparable to other cards 4 for the most part. However, one thing to note about card 4A is that if limited war is in effect and Russia's posture is Rapallo, you may change it to war. As a reminder, the Treaty of Rapallo was a mutual defense pact between France and the Soviet Union. This represents Russia honoring the terms of that treaty in the event of a war between Germany and France. Card 1A also unlocks card 27A, Great Patriotic War. Great Patriotic War is maybe not undisputedly the best card 27. However, it has a lot going for it. You get 5 strong tank steps that you can use to combine with other tanks in order to create 2-step tank armies. You also get a grand total of 13 steps that you get to place on the board, far more than any other card 27. Each card 27 has an unpleasant political event, a sort of poison pill that you have to swallow in order to complete your total war buildup in order to crush Germany. Among the different card 27 options, card 27A is surely the least bitter pill. The reason for this is because by the time you get around to playing card 27, the victory point marker is almost certainly going to be on its Axis tied side, and it's likely to be +1 or +2. As such, there's going to be a positive political die roll modifier in effect, meaning you're more likely to roll a 6. It's not that helpful if you're only at +1, but it's not hard for the Germans to get to +2 by the time you get to play this card. And if that's the case, then you have a 50-50 shot of getting purges no result. Let's quickly talk about some of these other card 27 results. Failure has two possible states, failure command and failure supply. A failure result allows the Axis faction to place what's called a failure marker on the map. This restricts your movement, combat, and support unit placement. For the purpose of this strategic overview, we'll sum it up as saying that failure supply results mean the Soviets are unable to press forward and attack the Germans, while a failure command result means the Soviets are unable to retreat from the Germans. As you can see, Great Patriotic War has the risk of failure command results. In essence, Stalin is telling the Red Army that they are not allowed to retreat. The other cards 27 include failure supply results, the result of German-friendly generals who are not purged being reluctant to attack their buddies. The other result in Great Patriotic War to look out for is mandated offensive. This requires that you launch an attack during the political events segment, or remove steps from the map. Failure to follow orders, as the design notes say, results in a purging of the ranks. The mandated offensive must include at least one armor step. We'll talk about some of the other possible outcomes of card 27 when we come back to it, after talking about our other cards 1. Card 1b, Tukhachevsky Reforms. This is easily the best card 1 to play in terms of its immediate effect. You add an HQ to your force pool, and you get a whole bunch of replacements that you put on the map right away. Card 4b, Red Army Mobilization, is also nothing to sneeze at. You're getting 2 solid mech steps and some infantry, and again your replacements are comparable to other cards 4. The problem, of course, is that the Tukhachevsky reforms mean you're not purging German-friendly generals from the Red Army. This can lead to card 27b, Red Army Conspiracy, which is definitely a high-risk, high-reward play. On the one hand, you're getting 3 2-1-3 tank steps that can combine together with other tanks to form tank armies, and you are getting several beefy multi-step mechanized armies. Let's take a quick look at those. So here are the 2-step tank units we've been talking about. They can combine with other tank steps to form these 4-3-3 armies. Meanwhile, the mechanized armies start off as 4-4-4s on their 2-step side, which you get by combining a tank step and an infantry step. Combining another tank step is going to get you a 7-6-4 army. That's very impressive. That's the reward. Let's talk about the risk. The problem with Red Army Conspiracy is that you're very likely to get political option axis or coup attempt. Those are very unpleasant results. Coup attempt means you're going to have to remove support units, possibly, remove armor type steps, possibly, or even remove an HQ off the map. It's very unpleasant. Political option axis, on the other hand, gives Germany a lot of possible actions it can take, either against you, against the Western faction, or with respect to neutral countries. It can also cause you or the Western faction to suffer a failure. So, Red Army Conspiracy definitely has the worst political event possibilities. As I say, it's high risk, high reward. The last card 1 is a very defensive play. Card 1C, Stalin Line Constructed. Instead of getting units, you get a whole bunch of forts. The card 4C that it opens up gives you even more forts. Card 27C, Red Army Reforms, is probably somewhere in between Great Patriotic War and Red Army Conspiracy with respect to the political possibilities. You don't have the terrible political option or coup attempt results. On the other hand, you're probably going to get a failure result rather than purges. It also easily has the worst reinforcements and replacements. Instead of getting multi-step tank units, you get 3 one-step tank units that can't combine together. You do get an HQ, which is nice though. One thing that we have to mention about card 1C is that it also forces you to remove Demand Eastern Poland and two other territorial demand cards. This could be important when it comes to deciding which card 5 you're going to play. Card 5A, Political Purges, as we noted before, is our inward turn. That opens up a chain of cards allowing us to demand territory from our neighbors, Eastern Poland, the Baltic states, and Bessarabia. Regardless of which card 5 we play, we're always going to be able to demand the Finnish frontier or, if we feel like it, the Turkish frontier. Historically, the Soviets don't demand the Turkish frontier. Card 5B, as we noted in the previous video, is more about building up a coalition of minor country partners. That card causes us to remove the Baltic State Demand and Bessarabia Demand cards, and in exchange, we have several pact cards that are going to allow us to align minor countries for the Soviet faction. As we noted during the Western faction strategy discussion, however, playing some of those cards too early can be counterproductive. In order to activate countries as Soviet countries, they cannot have the cordon posture. So we have to change their posture first, or have had it changed for us by the Germans. That brings us to our card 7. To be honest, I'm not sure that we ever want to play card 7A, Nazi-Soviet Pact, ourselves. The reason for that is most of the time, the Germans are going to play it for us. The other reason, of course, is that if we play card 5A, we're probably going to want to either try to play the Entente or leave our posture as Rapallo because of card 4A, which allows us to end the Rapallo posture, or card 17A or 17B. General Mobilization 17A is a card that we can always play. If Russia's posture is Rapallo, we can change it to war. 17B allows Russia to challenge Germany and get into the war. So, if Germany pursues a long limited war against Britain and France, Russian ultimatum is how we get into the war, even if our posture is pact. If we play card 7 Franco-Russian Entente, we're likely to be in the war early anyway, because of the two-front war effect. Unlike the Western faction Franco-Russian Entente card, our 7B card has no negative consequences for the Western faction. It does make us remove a demand card, so that's something to think about, especially because we will have already removed some of those cards due to previous card play. With all those considerations in mind, as I said, we probably don't ever want to play Nazi-Soviet Pact. Instead, we either want to threaten Germany with the possibility of card 4A Russian mobilization and an early war against Russia, or the possibility of the Franco-Russian Entente. Both of those will convince Germany to play the Nazi-Soviet Pact. At least that's our expectation. If we play card 5B Collective Security, and we don't feel like trying to set up the Franco-Russian Entente, we can always leave our posture as Rapallo and then play General Mobilization later on in order to change our posture to war. The downside of staying in Rapallo, of course, is that that means that the Soviet minor posture stays as cordon sanitaire, meaning we're not going to be linked with their posture in the event of German territorial demands. But maybe we don't care. Not least because we are expecting Germany to do that work for us by playing their Nazi-Soviet Pact card. With all that in mind, what are we going to do during this playthrough? For your first few playthroughs, it's probably not a bad idea to stick with the historical picks. For this playthrough, though, we're going to try something different. We're going to play Stalin Line Constructed as our card 1, and just see what happens. We're going to move some of these cards that we're going to get rid of down to the bottom, so they're out of the way. If we didn't mention it previously, just as a reminder, card 4D, Wartime Mobilization, although it is a card 4, can be played at any time as long as Russia's posture is war. If Germany decides to go after Russia first, we can play card 4D instead of card 4C. Just shuffle those out of the way. The other question is, what other cards do we need to play? we have to play card 5, 5 new 5-year plan. If nothing else, we need to play it in order to play Russian rearmament and pre-war production. During 1937, we're also going to want to play either card 5A or 5B. Because of the demand cards that we have to remove as a result of playing card 1C, I think we're going to go ahead and play card 5B, Collective Security. That way we're not losing cards out of our pre-war deck, so to speak. We can remove Demand Baltic States and Demand Bessarabia and still have the comparative pact cards, Negotiations with Baltic States and Balkan Pact, that we'll be able to play later. Let's plan to play Collective Security in the summer of 1937. The reason being here is if we look at the political table and we get some of these diplomatic success results, we can roll on the area table named in the result, and if the result is a neutral country, we apply the influence political event to it. At this point, that's not going to allow us to activate countries, but it is going to allow us to place influence markers that we'll be able to use later to activate countries, or at least to make it hard for the Germans to demand territories or activate countries themselves. With that in mind, let's shuffle some of these cards down here so they're out of the way and ready to be discarded. Where does that leave us? Well, we have a card that we're going to need to play in the autumn of 1937. If we're supporting the Republicans, we could play Support Republicans then. And if we're not, we could play pre-war production and get some armies out on the map. We could also play Litvinov Diplomacy. Any of those are certainly possibilities, so we're going to leave that card blank so we can make up our mind later. Looking ahead to 1938, our very first card is going to be Russian rearmament in spring 1938. What do we want to play during the summer? Well, we can't play Franco-Russian Entente until 1939 at the earliest. And to be honest, I'm not sure we're going to want to. We want to threaten to play Franco-Russian Entente, certainly, in order to force Germany's hand. But we might prefer to assume that Germany's going to play their card for Nazi-Soviet pact and allow us to start activating minors once the Soviet minor posture is packed. With that in mind, we're going to rely on card 9B, Litvinov Diplomacy, and pre-war production as card plays during 1938. Once again, if we're supporting the Republicans, we might also play Support Republicans, this time potentially during the summer instead of the autumn. Finally, we may end up having to play Forces for the Far East in 1938. Let's just zoom out a little and open up this track here. As you can see, in the summer of 1938, there is a Pacific Limited War marker. When that marker comes off the turn track as the turn moves to that summer turn, the Axis faction is going to roll a die. There is a 1 in 3 chance that the Western faction will end up at war with Japan, and a 1 in 3 chance that the Soviet faction will end up at war with Japan, and a 1 in 3 chance that war will get kicked down the can for a couple of seasons. Historically, it's likely that the Pacific Limited War gets kicked down the can a few seasons and then ends up assigned to Russia, whereupon we play Forces for the Far East in order to make sure that Zhukov is taking care of business. As such, any time from the summer of 1938 on, we may be called upon to play that card. We would certainly much rather get it than the Western faction, the reason being that the Western faction has to discard a limited war card that gives them extra British units. We're not really losing anything, especially in pre-war, by playing Forces for the Far East. With 1938 out of the way, let's consider what we want to do for 1939. First, and most obviously, let's slide that out of the way, we're going to want to play card 3, Continuing Rearmament. Once again, we have a lot of gaps which are going to depend on what other people do, the state of the war, and what we need to do. Maybe we'll need to play Forces for the Far East. Maybe we'll want to play Support Republicans. It's worth asking at this point if we want to play card 7B Franco-Russian Entente in the summer. It wouldn't be a bad play, but let's assume that the Germans are going to play card 4A Nazi-Soviet Pact. As we said, just the threat of the Franco-Russian Entente should be enough to force that play. Because of our ability to enter the war if our posture is Rapallo, even without 4A, we still have 17A. Once limited war starts, it's only a few seasonal turns to get to card 17A, if we want to go down that route. Between the Franco-Russian Entente and the threat of using general mobilization to enter the war, we're expecting that the Germans are going to play Nazi-Soviet Pact to lock us out of the war until they want to come after us. Or, in the event of a long limited war, we're able to play Russian Ultimatum. As such, we're expecting that starting in the summer, the posture of Soviet miners will have changed to Pact, meaning we're going to be able to start activating countries on our side. With that in mind, let's plan to play Central Alliance, negotiations with Baltic states, and Balkan Pact. We will mix those up with support Republicans, pre-war production, or forces for the Far East as we see fit. In 1940, we're going to play card 4C, of course, and we're going to play Comintern. Comintern is a weaker version of the German Pact of Steel card, but it's going to be pretty key to our adding countries to our coalition. That is the Soviet plan. With that in mind, let's get back to setting up Soviet units. Because we're not going to be able to demand Eastern Poland, if Germany wants to attack us, they're already going to start on the front line here at the border of Eastern Poland and the Soviet Union. As such, we're going to want to be able to block them off with forts. We might also defend the approaches to Moscow. The approaches to Leningrad, as well as the approaches to Kiev. We will keep our cavalry units in reserve for later combination. They can combine with tank steps to form these 333 Cav Mech armies. Those will be our first armored forces until we add more later in the war. That ends everyone's setup and is going to allow us to begin the scenario, which we will do next. The first thing to do is to determine the disposition of the Spanish Republicans. Which country, or should I say, which faction, is going to support the Spanish? For some reason, the vassal module doesn't have the Spanish flag marker, so we're just going to add that quickly before we proceed. A 6, according to the scenario setup instructions, a 6 is the Soviet faction. As such, the Soviets are the faction supporting the Spanish Republicans. Finally, each faction has to choose a pending card before play begins. This will be their card during the initial spring season. As discussed, the Axis faction is choosing card 1, Growing Works Established. The Western faction is choosing their card 1, Change of Governments. And the Soviet faction is choosing their card 1C, Stalin Line Constructed. Let's get on with the spring 1937 seasonal turn. The first thing that happens during a seasonal turn is a seasonal victory point check. This seasonal victory point check that we perform in the spring of 1937 is the only seasonal victory point check we're likely to have to perform until the war starts, and especially until strategic hexes start changing hands. As a reminder, the strategic value is the number of Western and Soviet strategic hexes under Axis control compared to the number of Axis strategic hexes under Western or Soviet control. I may not have mentioned earlier, but one caveat that applies to that is that Axis strategic hexes in policy-affected countries don't count towards the strategic value. That means that even though Metz is under French control and Madrid contains the Republican capital marker, because those countries are policy-affected countries, they don't affect the strategic value. Hence, the current strategic value is 0, and the VP marker is on 1 VP Allied Crusade. We know the strategic value is 0 because beyond the hexes in policy-affected countries, the Axis currently controls no Western or Soviet hexes. That concludes the seasonal victory point check. Let's get on with the Axis seasonal phase. The first thing they have to do is play their option card segment. During the option card segment, if you have a current card, you discard it. You flip your pending card over to your new current card. You then perform any option card segment actions on your card, if you have any, and finally pick a new pending card before proceeding with the rest of the seasonal phase. Let's go ahead and reveal German card 1, Goring Works established. The Germans add a bunch of armor steps to their force pool. Let's just quickly go over to the Axis force pool and organize these units. That's the end of the option card segment actions on the card, so we're going to need to pick a new option card. We've already planned to play support nationalists. Before we get too far along, though, we might want to rethink some of our territorial demands, because we know that the Soviets can't demand Eastern Poland any longer, at least not during pre-war. They do have a card called Further Concessions, I want to say, that allows them to make territorial demands of their neighbors. However, there's a good chance that we'll have conquered Poland before they get a chance to play that card, or maybe activated it as an ally for ourselves. As such, we may want to rethink demanding Lithuania. We may want to discard that card instead of the Ribbentrop Diplomacy card. Then we can either plan to play a Ribbentrop Diplomacy card, or we move our Czechoslovakia demand to 1938, demand Gamoseland in the spring of 1939, and the Polish corridor in the summer. But we can think about that a bit later when we revisit our strategy for 1938. With the Axis option card segment out of the way, we play through the rest of the turn. Let's actually bring that back up here. The initial administrative phase includes political events, support segment, when you play support units out of your force pool, those are your air and naval units, and set up convoy markers to shuttle units around on the map or keep them in supply. If you're trying to launch amphibious assaults, the support segment is also when you place a beachhead, or otherwise manage your beachhead marker. After the support segment is the organization segment, when you can combine units into larger units, break units down, as well as convert units into fortresses. Because we only have 2 infantry steps on the map right now, we don't have anything to do in that phase. And we don't have anything to do during operational movement, combat, or even reserve movement. As such, We're down to final administrative phase. The War and Peace segment allows you to declare war on minor countries. In pre-war, no one is allowed to declare war during the War and Peace segment. The downside of declaring war, by the way, during this segment is that you don't get to attack until your next turn. This can give your enemies a chance to reinforce the country you've declared war on. The last part of the final administrative phase is the conditional events segment. You normally check in order permanent conditional events that apply, and there's a list on our aid card here, which we can see there aren't very many permanent Axis conditional events. You also play any option card conditional events after the permanent ones. There are no permanent Axis conditional events that we need to check against right now, so we're just going to go ahead and place our 1 infantry step in Frankfurt. That's the end of the Axis turn. That brings us to the Western faction. The Western faction reveals change of governments. They don't have anything else to do during their option card segment, so they're going to prepare their pending card. They also have no political actions, no military affairs, and no maneuvering or combat. So we'll skip ahead right to their conditional event. Let's organize the force pool here a little bit before adding our French step. Which we will place in Paris. Finally, we have the Soviet turn. They reveal card 1C, Stalin Line Constructed. Let's go through and discard all the cards that we need to discard. We have to remove card 1A and 1B. We have to remove card 4A and 4B. Here we'll zoom in so we can see that better. Card 4A and 4B. We have to remove card 27A and 27B. And finally, we have to remove card 11 and 2 other demand cards. As discussed, we're planning to remove card 8A Demand Baltic States and 20A Demand Bessarabia. The next item is Apply Pacific Commitment. Right now, there's no Pacific War, so that is no result. Pacific Commitment might force us to place support units from our force pool or somewhere else on the board into the Pacific holding box, where they will stay until they are released later. The reason this action item exists on this card is the off chance of a very early war with Japan in the combined game. Obviously, we don't have to worry about it in a regular Total or Krieg game. The final option card action is to add some units to our force pool. We'll get rid of some of these cards, some of these counters here that we're not going to need. So, we have a bunch of forts to add to the force pool. And let's organize our force pool. That being the end of the Soviet option card segment, let's pick our next card. Since we're supporting the Republicans, we're going to plan to play support Republicans in the autumn. As we noted earlier, we don't necessarily want to end the Spanish Civil War in the Republicans' favor, but we do want to stall it out if we can manage that. That is the end of the Soviet seasonal phase. Is there anything we want to do during the regular turn? The answer is no. With all that done, that is the end of the March, April, Spring 1937 turn. We proceed to the April, May turn. First up to go are the Axis. They're going to move this unit down there. The French units right now are not extending a zone of control into Germany because they're policy-affected countries. Likewise, German units don't extend a zone of control into France, while France is a policy-affected country. If you're not familiar with the term, a zone of control is a very common concept in these hex and counter war games. Essentially, ground units exert a zone of control into adjacent hexes. These zones of control disrupt enemy movement and enemy lines of supply through those hexes. Because nobody's at war, of course, nobody is really projecting zones of control. That's the end of the Axis faction turn. Let's go ahead and proceed to the Western faction. The Western faction has no movement, so they're just going to place their next step. I forgot about the Germans placing their step. There they go. And there's the Western step, and we'll move right along. With the Soviets, they have nothing to do. I'm mistaken. The Soviets are going to convert one of their units to a fort during fortress conversion in the organization segment. In order to place a fort on the map, you take an existing one-step unit on the map, remove it from the map, and replace it with a fort. Most of the time, a one-step unit goes right back to your force pool. If a unit has a delay stripe, as the forts do, it's going to go in the delay box instead when you remove it from the map, regardless of the circumstances in which you remove it from the map. Since we have plenty of time, we're not going to worry too much about the central axis of advance towards Moscow just yet. We're going to convert this fortress up here. And we should be done converting units into forts by the end of the year. That's the Soviet turn. And that is the end of the spring season. Let's move on to the summer. We'll discard all of those cards and proceed with the seasonal phase. As discussed, we're not going to bother recalculating the strategic value. We know that it hasn't changed. First up, the Axis seasonal turn. The Axis reveals their new pending card, their new current card, 17 Support Nationalists. I should note that technically you don't discard your card until the actual start of your option cards segment. We're just doing it a little ahead of time so we don't accidentally lose track of which card we've played. This way we know that we still have to play everyone else's cards this season. We met the selection requirements, so we're good to go to play this card. During the option card segment, we have something to do. If there is a civil war country, which there is, you may either remove one influence or neutrality marker, or roll on one area table with political diral modifiers. If the result is a neutral or friendly minor country, apply influence to it. So, the question is, do we want to remove a neutrality marker, or do we want to roll on an area table? Rolling on an area table is likely to give us a one in 3 chance of no result and a 2 in 3 chance of selecting a country. Let's look at the area tables again. Because of the -1 political dyro modifier, a 6 result is impossible, but we can get the 1 result twice. As such, the odds of a no result effect are unchanged. One thing to watch out for when rolling on the central table is the possibility of rolling Austria. Because we already have an influence marker on Austria, rolling Austria on the central table would result in us activating it as an Axis country, which I suppose we could do, but it's more convenient if we don't. The reason for this is a phenomenon called Axis occupation. Let's actually perform a little aside and talk a little bit about minor countries' militaries. Minor countries don't get along very well with each other on the whole. Minor country ground units may not stack together in the same hex unless they are expeditionary units. Those are units that have the EXP symbol or EXP text on their counter. So for example, this Belgian cavalry is an EXP unit. This Czech mechanized unit is also an EXP unit, and we can see a few other examples here and there. This also applies to the Italians and French, because in this game, they're minor countries. The other thing to note is the Axis is even more limited with respect to its minor countries due to a phenomenon called minor country occupation, something that the Western and Soviet factions are not subject to. The long and short of it is, with Axis occupation, Axis multi-step units cannot exist in a minor country, or I should say an Axis minor country, if at the end of the turn, during the conditional events segment, a German multi-step unit exists in an Axis minor country. That multi-step unit has to immediately break down into one-step units. There are 2 possible exceptions. The first is if the multi-step unit is a multinational unit, and one of its constituent steps is a minor country step of the same nationality as the hex the unit currently occupies. The other exception is if the country has a no occupation marker placed in its capital. Here are the no occupation markers here. It's pretty hard to get no occupation markers on the map. Because of how central Vienna is, right, it's right there, right next to Germany proper, we probably don't want to have to depend on single-step German units to defend it later in the war. As such, we'd prefer not to activate Austria. As such, we're probably going to avoid rolling on the central table with our Civil War card. That's too bad, because being able to guarantee Czechoslovakia, I shouldn't say guarantee, there's no guarantee, but increasing the chances of a successful demand on Czechoslovakia would certainly be helpful. With that in mind, do we want to roll on an area table? There's a small chance that we could end the Civil War this summer. As such, we probably don't need to feel obliged to remove the neutrality marker in Italy. We'll probably get a chance to play support nationalists again. So let's try our luck and roll on an area table. Which table should we roll on? We're not trying to undertake a northern strategy where we align Sweden and Finland ahead of time. We'll be able to bring Finland in easily enough, assuming the Soviets demand the Finnish frontier, which they're very likely to because that gets them an interceptor. With that in mind, let's plan to roll on the Balkan area table. We could roll on the Middle East table, but the only country we really care about is Turkey. So we're not going to worry about that. The Balkans, on the other hand, can be quite useful. Having Romania as an ally before an attack on Russia would be very handy. Having Yugoslavia as an ally would be handy because it's going to open up aligning other countries. Having Greece as an ally could be handy because that would allow us to align Turkey. Bulgaria, not so useful. We'd much rather have Yugoslavia as an Axis ally than have to conquer it and then garrison all those mountain hexes against partisans later in the war. The same arguably goes for Greece. So, we're going to roll on the Balkan area table. Let's bring that up and get ready for the roll. Remember, there's a -1 Diro modifier in effect. 6 becomes 5, Yugoslavia. That's a great start. It also means that if one of the Allied factions is able to place an influence marker in Yugoslavia, instead of placing a marker, they're just going to remove ours. So even without an influence marker, we do have the possibility of bringing Yugoslavia in as an ally with our limited war treaty cards. We only run into trouble if Yugoslavia has an influence marker belonging to another faction, or a neutrality marker. So this is a pretty good start. That's the end of the option card segment, apart from picking a new pending card. So let's get that done with. As per our plan, we're going to play German rearmament. Now we'll proceed with a regular turn. After, I should say, we place replacements. We should place replacements with the assumption that we're going to get country resists results and potentially fight a war, at least in 1939. As such, given we're planning on demanding Czechoslovakia in the spring of 1939, at least right now, we're going to plan to envelop the Czech army and destroy it. We'll place our replacement there. The first thing we do during the regular turn is our political event. Before rolling, let's take a quick look at the possible outcomes. While a 6 result is not possible due to the Diro modifier, the -1 modifier means that a 1, 2, or 3 is going to result in a civil war victory. So we have a 50% chance of a civil war victory. That's pretty good. We have a 1 in 6 chance of a stalemate, no result, a 1 in 6 chance of rolling on the civil war table, and a 1 in 6 chance of no pasaran. That is not a good outcome. No pasaran forces us to either remove an Axis step from the map or suffer a Civil War defeat result. Civil War victory allows us to flip Republican markers over to their nationalist side. We have to flip over Republican territory markers first. Only when the Republican capital is the last marker remaining can we flip it over to its nationalist side. Civil War defeat will allow the Allies to flip over nationalist markers to their Republican side. When the Allies are playing their turns, those results are reversed. An Allied Civil War victory allows them to flip nationalist markers to the Republican side, and an Allied Civil War defeat allows us, the Axis, to flip Republican markers to their nationalist side. Similarly, the nationalist capital can only be flipped when there are no other nationalist markers. As we can see, no pasaran is a very costly result, so we're certainly hoping to avoid it. Let's take a quick look at the Civil War table and see what can possibly happen when we roll on it. Because of the Diro modifier currently in effect, it is not possible to roll on the conference table. However, it does give us a 1 in 3 chance rather than a 1 in 6 chance of Republican infighting. Republican infighting allows the Axis to choose either to win a Civil War victory result, flipping a Republican marker over to its nationalist side, or to flip the Republican support marker, changing the faction that is currently supporting the Republicans. Both of those are pretty valuable. Civil War victory, obviously, because it brings us one step closer to ending the Civil War with a nationalist victory, and flipping the Republican support marker over, because it might just screw over the Allied faction currently supporting the Republicans, especially if they're just about to play their own support Republicans card. As we can see on the Allied support Republicans cards, not only does there need to be a Civil War country for its political event, but the Republican support marker has to be flipped over to the same side as the faction playing the card. Because the Soviets are the current supporters of the Spanish Republicans, if they play their support Republicans card and the Western Republican support markers on the map, the Soviets don't get to do anything. Strictly speaking, the Axis faction doesn't know when the Soviets are going to play their support Republican marker card. However, we know that they have a lot fewer demands on their card slots during pre-war than the Western faction do. As such, they're more likely to play Republican support. As such, if we get Republican infighting, it's probably more valuable for us to flip over the Republican support marker. We've already seen what no pasaran does, so if we have to roll on the Civil War table, we're once again hoping to avoid that. Rolling on the guarantee table is going to mean rolling on one of the other political tables. We're not going to talk about that though until we actually get to rolling on the table, just so we're not talking too much about these table results. The bell tolls for thee works similarly to no pasaran, but is much better. No pasaran requires you to choose either to take a step loss or to suffer a Civil War defeat result. The bell tolls for thee allows you to take a step loss in order to win a Civil War victory result. If you don't take a step loss, nothing happens. The worst case scenario, no result. That's not too bad. The best case scenario, if you feel like you can spare a step, is to advance the Civil War. At this point, I'm not sure we'd want to lose steps, and we certainly don't want to really lose good German steps. Maybe if we had a minor country ally, we could afford to sacrifice some of their steps. The last outcome we haven't looked at is provincial independence. As we can see on the map, there are two little regions of Spain, Basque and Catalonia. If we achieve the political independence result, any of those regions that are currently controlled by the Republicans could break away from Spain and become an independent minor country. On the Civil War table, that means about half the results are good for the Axis. The bell tolls for thee is okay as long as we're willing to spend a step. The guarantee table could be okay, a no pasaran is just bad. So we don't mind rolling on the Civil War table. Because Republican infighting is more likely to happen than other results, the Western and Soviet factions probably want to avoid that table. With all that talk out of the way, let's carry on with our Spanish Civil War political event roll. A 6 becomes a 5. Stalemate, no result. For the rest of the German turn, all we're going to do is complete setting up our defense on the French frontier. And that's it. Let's carry on with the Western faction. The Western faction reveals Chamberlain diplomacy. The first thing they have to do is pick a new pending card, which is going to be British rearmament. Next, they place a replacement step on the board. As you can see, we're running low already on British steps, especially the 1-2-2 steps that are slightly better defensively. We're going to want to have at least one 1-1-3 step on the board early to place in Kuwait because of how some of our limited war cards affect Middle Eastern politics. But we don't have to worry about that right now. What we're especially looking for are units to defend Great Britain and to deploy to France. Now that we're finished the British seasonal phase, let's carry on. Like the Axis, they have a political event to start their turn. One becomes one. That's a roll on the guarantee table. Before we look at the guarantee table, let's just look at the possible outcomes on this card. It's not possible to roll on the guarantee table with a 6 because of the die roll modifier, but we do have an extra chance of rolling on the guarantee table on a 1 because of the die roll modifier. So it's a 1 in 3 chance of rolling on the guarantee table. There's a 1 in 6 chance of rolling on the conference table, and a 1/2 chance of no result. So it's not great. As usual for diplomatic cards, it's pretty unreliable. Now that we're rolling on the guarantee table, let's see what that table does. The guarantee table has a 1 in 3 chance of taking us to the conference table on a roll of 1 or 6. There's a 1 in 3 chance of no result. There's also a 1 in 3 chance of minor country politics. When this political event occurs, the faction that receives the event has to pick an area table and roll on it. If the result is a neutral country, the Axis can choose for the result to be no result, or the Axis faction can roll on the diplomatic incident table over here. I'm not going to say anything about the table unless we actually roll on it at this point, except to say that it has results that can definitely blow up in someone's face. One thing to watch out for with minor country politics is if the result is a Western country, you have to remove Western steps from that country. As such, the Western faction probably doesn't want to pick the Western table and result in rolling France. Axis or Soviet minor countries that come up as a result of minor country politics might start a war with one of their neighbors. So again, it could blow up in your face. Let's see what happens when we roll on this table. 5 becomes 4. Conflicting plans, no result. What else do we have to do during the Western turn? We don't have any support. During the organization segment, we have a couple of things to do. We're going to combine the French units in Paris. The one-step unit there returns to the force pool, and this unit flips over to its two-step side, the 7th Army. One of the parts of the organization segment is detachments. During the detachment step, we can place detachments in hexes containing friendly ground units. As we've noted previously, detachments are sort of sub-unit levels of military organization that allow ports to act as what the game calls open ports. You need an open port to trace supply through the port. You also need an open port to conduct naval transport into the port. Because of our shortage of British units, we're actually going to remove a couple of British detachments right now during the detachment step. The reason for this is because detachments on their other side are units. Our thinking here is we're not likely to need to ship units to Cyprus anytime soon, so we're going to remove that detachment right now. We're also thinking we won't need to ship units directly into Alexandria. During operational and reserve movement, we're going to be able to ship units overseas from Great Britain into these off-map boxes. The West Africa box and the Eastern US-Canada box. From the West Africa box, we can then reach the East Africa box or the Middle East off-map box. And from those boxes, we can get onto the map in Kuwait or Egypt. As such, we don't have to rely on shipping units to Alexandria through the Mediterranean. As such, we don't really need a detachment there. With that out of the way, we have a couple of extra steps that we're going to be able to place on the map to defend Britain or deploy to France, or maybe to Egypt. That's going to end the Western faction turn. Let's carry on with the Soviets. The Soviets reveal collective security. During the option card segment, we have to remove a whole bunch more cards. 5A Political Purges, 7A Nazi-Soviet Pact. 8A Demand Baltic States, 9A Molotov Diplomacy. We've already removed Demand Baltic States thanks to our play of card 1C, but we do have to remove Molotov Diplomacy. Card 10A Eastern Bloc, 20A Demand Bessarabia, and 22A Intervention. We've already removed Demand Bessarabia, again because we played card 1C, so we're going to remove Eastern Bloc and Intervention. With nothing else to do in the option card segment, we have to pick our new pending card. And, as planned, we're going to pick Support Republicans. The next thing that happens is that Russia gets 2 infantry steps to place on the map. Let's plan to place them in Minsk. That concludes the Soviet seasonal phase. During the initial administrative phase, we have a political event on our card. Let's look at it. There are 3 possible diplomatic success results. Because of the diroll modifier, there's a 1 in 3 chance of diplomatic success Balkans, a 1 in 3 chance of no result, and a 1 in 6 chance of getting either diplomatic success Central or diplomatic success Western. No result is what you imagine it would be. Diplomatic success allows you to roll on the area table named in the event, and if the result of that roll is a neutral or friendly minor country, you are able to apply the influence political event to it. At this point, we don't have any friendly minor countries, there are no active Soviet minors, and if we achieve a neutral country result, all we'll be able to do is place an influence marker. Because the Soviet minor posture is codon, we're not going to be able to activate countries as Soviet minor countries. As such, we're really hoping to spread around influence markers, both with a view to setting up future activations of Soviet minors, and to keep minor countries out of Germany's hands. Let's go ahead and roll on our political event table here. 1 becomes 1. Diplomatic success Balkans. We now have to roll on the Balkan area table. 5 becomes 4. Let's see what that is. Greece. Greece is a neutral country with no influence marker, so we're going to go ahead and add a Soviet influence marker to Greece. That's great. It means, if nothing else, it's quite a bit more difficult for Germany to bring Greece in as an Axis minor country. It also means, potentially later, we could end up activating Greece as a Soviet minor. That's the end of the Soviet political event. Let's carry on with their turn. The Soviets don't have anything to do during their support segment. During their organization segment, they're going to go ahead and organize their 2 infantry steps that they placed as replacements into the 5th Army. They're also going to convert another unit into a fortress. And for the rest of their turn, during operational movement, they're going to move that unit into the swamp. They have no combat, so during reserve movement, they're just going to go ahead and move that unit down here. It's going to be stacked with that unit once it turns into a fort later on. Since we've just performed operational and reserve movement, let's just talk about a little bit how those work. We'll get into more detail once we're actually in the war and conducting a lot more movement. Broadly speaking, when you conduct operational movement, you can move units hex to hex, sort of ordinary movement on the map from one hex to another until you run out of movement allowance. Movement allowance is the rightmost number on each ground unit's bottom part of the counter here, right? 112, the 2 is an infantry unit's movement allowance, 3 is a Russian cavalry unit movement allowance. German infantry have a movement allowance of 3. French have different movement allowance for their infantry depending on how good they are, and so on and so forth. You can also move units port to port, as long as you have a convoy in the convoy box of the sea area that you're shipping them through, and as long as you're shipping them from an open port to an open port. Finally, you can ship units to or from off-map boxes. You can ship them from a port to an off-map box, from an off-map box to any other off-map box that connects to the box you're shipping from, and in some cases, you can move directly from an off-map box into a hex. For instance, the East Africa box allows Western units to enter the South map edge. The Eastern Soviet box, or Central Asia box, I should say, allows Soviet units to enter along the Eastern map edge. Those little marks in those hexes indicate that Axis units are not allowed to enter the map edge hexes. That means that even in the worst case, where the Soviet Union is blown off the map, Russian units will always be able to build up in the Central Asia box and come back without being blocked. Reserve movement functions identically to operational movement with a couple of differences, the most important of which is that units moving during reserve movement may not enter or leave enemy zones of control. One last thing about movement. One-step units moving along rail lines during operational movement are able to move more quickly. Instead of spending entire hexes worth of movement allowance entering each hex in their path, while they're traveling along a road or rail line, one-step units spend only half a hex. For instance, a Russian infantry unit can move up to 4 hexes along a road or rail line as long as it is a one-step unit. 1, 2, 3, 4, for example. Likewise, a Russian cavalry unit could move up to 6 hexes along a road or rail line. During reserve movements, one-step units can also move more quickly along road or rail lines, but only in friendly territory. When moving through enemy countries or dependents, they do not get this movement bonus. For example, that means it's fairly easy for German units to switch from the Western to Eastern fronts while passing through Germany, but German units entering Russia proper are going to move more slowly during reserve movement, even if they're one-step units. Now, where were we? We have finished the Russian turn. So let's move on. During the Axis turn, we're going to go right ahead and play their political event. One becomes one. Civil War victory. Because of the possibility of provincial independence, the Axis faction is going to ignore Catalonia for now. We're going to flip over Valencia. That is going to be the end of the Axis turn. Carrying on with the Western faction. Two becomes one. Once again, we're rolling on the guarantee table. Let's see what happens. 4 becomes 3. Conflicting plans, no result. The Western faction has no movement, so let's carry on with the Soviet faction. One becomes 1. Diplomatic success Balkans again. We roll on the Balkan area table. We're definitely hoping for a country other than Greece this time, because we can't yet activate Greece due to its posture. 4 becomes 3. What's that? On the Balkan table, 3 is Romania. That is a great result. Obviously, the Soviets are pleased with their collective security approach so far, and we're hoping, as the Russians, that the Germans are doing a little gnashing of teeth right about now. If nothing else, it's going to be that much harder for the Axis to bring Romania in as an Axis country. And when we get to the point where our posture has changed, we'll hopefully be able to bring it in as a Soviet country. We don't have any movement, but we're still going to convert a unit into a fort, this time the unit in Minsk. That's going to end the Soviet faction turn. That brings us to the last turn of the summer season. We have one more round of political events for everyone. Support nationalists, first of all. Five becomes 4. Roll on Civil War table. Let's see what happens. 5 becomes 4. Roll on guarantee table. 1 becomes 1. Roll on conference table. All right, now that we're rolling on the conference table, let's talk about what these possible outcomes are. Conflicting plans no result is what you think it would be. The most common outcome on the conference table is military aid. Military aid isn't that great for the Axis, but it's not the worst. The phasing faction that receives a military aid result may do one of the following. Receive one minor country step unit and place it as a replacement. Receive one colonial step unit, which can be a major or minor country unit, and receive it as a replacement. Or turn this event into a delay reduction event and resolve it immediately. If you have a unit on the turn track as the result of delay rolls, and you receive delay reduction, you can move that unit one turn closer to the current turn on the track, allowing it to come back into play earlier. Obviously, delay reduction isn't very helpful right now. It'll be much more helpful later on when everyone has lots of units on the turn track. So military aid isn't helping the Germans very much right now, but it could help the Western faction since French units are minor country steps. Germany supports nationalists at this point is going to allow Germany to roll on the Civil War table. It could also allow Germany to receive and place German colonial or Axis minor country steps. Obviously, neither of those apply right now. There are no German colonial units in the force pool, and there are no active Axis minors. It can also allow us to pick a hex in France and force the Western faction to remove a step from that hex. We could do the same with any other Western or Soviet minor country or colonial unit, or in other cases, detachments or logistics markers. We'll talk about logistics markers when we get to them. The bottom line is, it's not bad, and it's a great way to pick off some French, possibly. Ally support resistance works somewhat the same way. Instead of getting to place minor country or colonial steppes, though, they can get partisan bases, at least once limited war has started. Partisan bases are going to let them activate or reactivate countries that have been conquered by the Axis. Then they'll be able to place units of the same nationality on the partisan base as a reinforcement location. That's obviously going to be a problem in places like Yugoslavia. The other thing allies can do with ally support resistance is roll on the Civil War table themselves, or pick off Axis minor steppes, Axis colonial steppes, and detachment and logistics markers. Right now, the only thing that the Allies would be able to do if they receive Ally support resistance is roll on the Civil War table. The final result on the conference table is neutrals pressured. Neutrals pressured allows you to place influence markers on the map. Unlike the influence political event, however, it doesn't allow you to activate countries, only place markers on the map. You can also convert it into minor country politics result if you want to potentially see countries blow up in your face. It can also allow countries to end policies in the posture box, as long as the VP marker reads Axis tied. Certain policies cannot be ended in this way. For instance, the United States cannot end the isolationism policy through neutrals pressured. There are a few other effects for neutrals pressured. We're not going to talk about those right now. For our purposes, as Germany, the main effect of neutrals pressured will be to allow us to place influence markers or remove neutrality and enemy influence markers from the map. We might consider removing the Soviet influence marker in Romania, for instance. Or if we're looking to enhance our prospects for a later territorial demand, we might place one ourselves in Czechoslovakia. Now that we've discussed the conference table outcomes, let's roll on the conference table. 2. That becomes 1. That's unfortunate. Military aid. With no units on the turn track to reduce the delay, or minor country or colonial steppes to place, this becomes no result. Remember how we talked about how political die rolls are unreliable in our first video in this series. Here we've just had an object example. Despite 3 die rolls on the Spanish Civil War card, with a 50% chance each time of a Civil War victory, we only ended up with 1 Civil War victory. Thankfully, the other results were all no result instead of no pasarán. But there we have it. The unreliability of politics in action. The same could be said for Chamberlain diplomacy, which thus far has been no result both times we've rolled on the event. With the Axis turn over, let's carry on to the Western faction turn. They're going to see if they can finally make something happen with Chamberlain diplomacy. One becomes 1. Roll on the guarantee table. Unlike the Axis, military aid on the conference table would be a great result for the Western faction. Getting more French steppes is always valuable. 2 becomes 1. A roll on the conference table. 5 becomes 4. Conflicting plans, no result. A disappointing summer for the Western faction. With nothing else to do, they pass their turn on to the Soviets. The Soviets have their political event first. Thus far, the Soviet political events have been the most successful, with 2 out of 3 results successfully resulting in influence markers being placed in different countries. Will the Soviets be able to achieve a three-peat, so to speak? Let's find out. 5 becomes 4. Roll on the guarantee table. Let's roll. 4 becomes 3, conflicting plans, no result. Not the greatest, but the Soviets can definitely feel pretty good about having achieved the most during this summer as far as politics goes. The last thing the Soviets are going to do is convert another unit into a fort. That's going to end the 1937 summer season. Once again, just to make it easy to keep track of things, we're going to discard our current cards. The Chamberlain Diplomacy card is recyclable, so it has to go back into the Western faction deck. And we're just going to shuffle it over. Well, we can leave it in place here. Normally we might put it in order of play, but since we're almost done 1937, we'll just leave it there. Next up, the autumn seasonal phase. The Germans reveal German rearmament. To start off with, they have to remove one Ribbentrop diplomacy or demand card. In keeping with their planning, they're going to remove Demand Switzerland. As we discussed earlier, we do have to rethink whether or not we want to demand Lithuania. Now that we know the Soviets can't demand Eastern Poland until quite possibly much later in the war, we may not need to demand Lithuania. We're going to likely start the war already right up front on the Russian frontier instead of having to fight through Eastern Poland, so we don't need to outflank it. And if we start with control of Eastern Poland, in the event the Soviets activate the Baltic states as a Soviet minor, we're already going to start having seriously outflanked and compromised any potential Soviet defense of the Baltic states. As such, we maybe don't want to demand Lithuania. Let's think about that, but not right now. For now, we're going to pick our penning card. Well, no. First, let's finish the rest of the option card segment normally. The next thing to do is remove one production directive card. The production directive cards are total war cards. We have atomic bomb, helicopters, jet fighters, the Kriegsmarine Z plan, Type 21 U-boats, and Eurobombers. Each of these cards, in the case of the non-atomic bomb cards, is going to get us a unit, either a land unit in the case of helicopters, or a support unit. Each of those cards, excluding atomic bombs, also grants us a special marker. Several of these markers make it more likely that the Allies will suffer longer delay results over the course of the game, which is pretty good. Helicopters is a little bit different. It's going to increase the mobility of German forces. Because of the unreliability of political die rolls, however, we can't really count on getting any of those units or markers on the board. Even if we do get them on the board, by the time we're likely to play those cards during Total War, they're likely to be too little too late, just like in the real war. There is one thing we'll note about rolling on the directive table. We're not going to talk about that too much just now until we actually get to it. But one thing to note about rolling on the directive table, if you roll on the directive table, there is a chance that you can achieve a success result for a production directive card that you have already played. That becomes important with card 37 V weapons, which lets us roll on the directive table every turn. And that becomes important when we're looking at which production directive card we're going to discard, because production directive atomic bomb requires the play of V weapons, while none of the others do. That means we can play one of our other production directive cards before playing V weapons. And if we don't get both the unit and the marker from that play, we could potentially get it later with V weapons. But atomic bomb is not the case. We're not going to be able to play it until much later. Possibly when it's too late for it to make any difference. As such, we're going to discard Atomic Bomb. Since we're looking at Total War cards, we're going to get rid of this Götterdämmerung card. That is an optional rule card, which we're not playing with optional rules, so we're just going to get rid of it right now. Going back to card 2, we have to add some units to our force pool. And let's just organize those quickly. We will put our HQs here, and we'll just throw those right there. We then have to pick a pending card. I'm going to pick, as planned, military purchase. When we get to playing military purges, we're going to take a closer look at how we want to change our demands in response to the Soviet card play. During the replacement segment, we have to place an infantry and armor step. Once again, we're going to assume that if we demand Czechoslovakia and the demand goes bad, that we're going to have to attack Czechoslovakia. So let's plan to place an armor step and an infantry step in the vicinity. That's it for the German faction turn. We're not going to bother combining units just yet, even though we could. There's nothing particular to be gained doing that at this point, so we'll just leave those as is. That brings us to the Western faction turn. The Western faction reveals their new current card, British Rearmament. Pacific Commitment does not apply since there's no Pacific War yet, so they just have to add units to their force pool. Let's organize those units. Surface Fleet, Troop Convoy, the BEF unit. One interesting thing about this unit is it can combine with a Western minor infantry step to form the Allied army. So that is a natural unit to send to France early in the war. And of course a whole bunch of armor steps. Sadly not as good as the German panzers. Last but not least, we'll pick a new pending card, which we already know is going to be Chamberlain Diplomacy again. The Western faction has no units to move, so we're going to skip right on ahead to the Soviet faction. The Soviets reveal their pending card as their new current card, Support Republicans. They have to pick a new pending card, which is going to be a new 5-year plan. They place a replacement step. And then they have to roll on their political event. Six becomes 5. The bell tolls for thee. As discussed, the Soviets can trade an infantry step for a Civil War victory result with the bell tolls for thee. Do they want to? I would say that it would be no question that we want to if we had, say, played card 1B Tukhachevsky reforms, and we'd have a whole bunch of extra steps on the board. I'm not entirely sure we want to now, but on the other hand, out of all the factions in the game, the Soviets had the easiest time making good on lost steps. So let's go ahead and do that. Our brand new unit that we put down on the board gets removed right away, and we get to convert that to a Civil War victory. We want to avoid flipping over potential breakaway provinces. So we're going to go ahead and flip Valencia over. Not too shabby. I'm not sure that we'll repeat that if we get the bell tolls for the again, but it's good to stall out the Civil War. The last thing the Soviets are going to do is convert another fortress. That's going to end the Soviet turn. That brings us back to the Axis faction for September-October. The Axis faction have no political events and nothing else to do, so we'll skip right ahead to the Western faction. They also have nothing to do and no political events, so we'll skip right ahead to the Soviets. Six becomes five. The bell tolls for thee again. So now we have to ask ourselves, is it worth it removing one of our steps for a Civil War victory? How much do we care about stalling out the Spanish Civil War? At this point, we would actually end up ahead of the starting position, which would be good. We're mostly looking to stall out the war until the real war begins, at which point the Germans are less likely to want to spare the time to play support nationalists. Once Spain is no longer a policy-affected country, even while it is neutral, its hex will count as under Western or Soviet control for the purpose of strategic value as long as the Republican capital is on the board. The Western faction probably wouldn't want to make the trade. However, we have our rather more disposable Red Army units. We're likely going to want to have to play pre-war production more often if we keep this up. But let's go ahead and remove a unit for another victory. Once again, to avoid the possibility of breakaway province results, we're going to flip over La Coruna. On the whole, the Soviet faction has had the best luck with political results, albeit at the cost of Soviet lives now. The last thing the Soviets are going to do is convert their last fortress. With the Soviet autumn turn over, it's time to proceed to the winter season. Once again, we're going to discard cards ahead of time. Support Republicans is recyclable, so it goes back in the Soviet deck. Just shuffle it a little out of the way here for later. For their winter seasonal turn, the Axis are revealing military purges. There's not a lot going on with this card except that we have to remove Ribbentrop diplomacy or demand cards. It's a little bit of a poison pill. What cards are we going to remove? We may not want to demand Lithuania now. We're not getting any territorial benefit out of it, so we might actually want to discard that card. With the Soviet victories in the Civil War, we're certainly likely to need to play support nationalists quite possibly once again in 1939 if we're going to try and win the Civil War. With that in mind, we might only get to play 3 demand cards during the 1938-1939 period. We could remove Demand Lithuania and Demand Denmark, move Demand Czechoslovakia to fall 1938, and play support nationalists in the spring. If we're okay with foregoing a couple of steps, we could play Nazi-Soviet Pact in the spring instead and play support nationalists in the summer. And there might be something to that. We'll play that by ear. We probably want to leave a Ribbentrop diplomacy card in reserve in case we want to extend pre-war, particularly if Demand Go Mauseland does not result in country resists. Remember, we're trying to get country resist results to start the war. So we want to be cagey with our demand cards, especially if we have to extend pre-war, because we want to be able to play card 6 if we extend pre-war. With that in mind, we're going to discard demand Denmark and demand Lithuania. And we'll move demand Czechoslovakia to the autumn 1938 turn. The last thing we do is select our pending card for spring 1938. Having finished its option card segment, Germany has nothing else to do. So let's carry on with the Western faction. The Western faction reveals Chamberlain diplomacy. They're going to pick their pending card and then place the reinforcements. Perfectly timed, we can place the BEF. And then we have a political event. After 3 turns of nothing, the Western faction is certainly hoping to make something happen here. 5 becomes 4. Roll on conference table. That's vaguely promising since there's only one result that is no result, but nothing is guaranteed. 5 becomes 4. Conflicting plans, no result. That's going to end the Western faction turn. Before proceeding to the Soviet turn, I should mention that we're not currently permitted to move the BEF unit into France. During pre-war, no unit can move or attack outside of its home country or one of its dependents. Likewise, no support unit or airdrop marker can be placed in a hex, naval zone box, or strategic warfare box. A convoy marker can be placed in a convoys box. As such, British units cannot yet enter France. That will change once limited war starts. Let's carry on with Soviet turn. The Soviets reveal their pending card, new 5-year plan. During the option card segment, the Soviets have to remove one of their production directive cards. These work the same as the German production directive cards. They're going to add late war capability to the Soviet force pool. They're not quite as good as the Axis cards, but on the other hand, you don't have to roll on a political event to get them. You just get whatever marker or unit you're getting. We also have this card to get rid of since that's an optional rule we're not playing with. The 4 production directorate cards that Soviets have are Factory Production, Heavy Bombers, Red Air Force, and Red Navy. The Red Air Force card is probably the most useful card since an Air Force is an extremely valuable unit. The War Production marker is probably going to be our next priority because that reduces delay rolls on Soviet units. Out of the 2 remaining cards, we'd probably rather have the Bomber over the Navy. Naval operations just aren't that important for the Soviet Union in totaler Krieg. We might change our mind if we were playing a combined map and we thought we might actually be fighting Japan. Since we're not, we're just going to go ahead and discard the Red Navy Production Directorate. We then have to pick a new pending card, which is going to be Russian rearmament. Finally, we don't get any replacements, so we're just rolling on the political event. Two becomes 1. Roll on guarantee table. One becomes 1. Roll on conference table. Two becomes 1. Military aid. Because we don't have any minor countries, this isn't going to be very helpful. Military aid is no result for the Soviets. Having converted all their units into fortresses, the Soviets have nothing else to do, so play passes back to the Axis. We're starting 1938, but because we're on the last turn of a season, we're just going to continue playing until the end of this turn and the start of the spring season. The Axis has nothing to do, so they'll pass play on to the Western faction. The Western faction has their diplomatic event. 6 becomes 5. Conflicting plans, no result. At this point, Chamberlain diplomacy has been a huge dud politically for the Western faction, with 5 out of 5 possible outcomes all being no result. They pass play on to the Soviet faction. Three becomes 2. Conflicting plans, no result. The new 5-year plan is also a political dud. With that done, we're going to stop here and start the next video in the spring of 1938. To get it out of the way, we'll discard these cards and return Chamberlain Diplomacy to the Western faction deck. That brings us to the end of this video, and what a doozy. We're likely only going to see videos this long once we get towards the end of the war, and we have these massive Allied armies that we have to think carefully about how they're going to smash through German lines. Hopefully, you've found this to be an entertaining and educational start to the game. If you enjoyed this video, please feel free to like and subscribe, and we hope to see you soon.